Most Christians are trying to walk, but were never established. And because of that, something never quite settles. They move forward, they adjust, they try again, and still there is a sense that something underneath it all is not stable. The problem is not effort. The problem is order. Standing comes first, not movement. Foundation comes first, not progress. And if that foundation is not clear, then everything built on top of it will feel uncertain, no matter how much effort is applied. Volume 1 was never about moving forward, it was about being grounded. But most people hear that, agree with it, and then move on too quickly, before it actually becomes real to them. So now they are trying to build something on what was never fully settled, and they feel it. Something never locks into place. Something always feels like it could shift at any moment. Because grace was never understood as position. It was only understood as something to do. And that changes everything. Because grace is not where you go. It is where you stand, already given, already complete. And if that is not clear, then everything becomes effort. You try to stay right, you try to improve, you try to hold everything together. But nothing truly settles, because the ground itself was never established. So this does not move forward yet. It goes back to foundation, back to what should have been clear first. Standing comes before walking, always. And until that is real, nothing else will hold the way it should. Because once that foundation is unclear, everything that followeth begins to carry weight it was never meant to carry. What should be steady starts to feel fragile, and what should be simple starts to feel complicated. So the focus shifts without even realizing it. Instead of standing, people begin managing behavior, managing thoughts, managing consistency, always adjusting, always trying to keep something from slipping. And over time, that becomes the normal experience. A quiet pressure underneath everything, not always obvious, not always overwhelming, but always present. Because the question has been misplaced. It is no longer, where am I standing? It becomes, how am I doing? And that one shift changes everything. Because now the reference point is movement instead of position, performance instead of placement, and when that happens, stability is replaced with effort. So the cycle continues, more awareness, more effort, more correction, but never the sense that anything is fully settled. Not because something is missing, but because something was never seen clearly in the first place. Because if the position were clear, the pressure would not remain the same. If the standing were understood, the effort would not carry the same weight. But when that is not the case, everything has to be maintained. Everything has to be managed. Everything has to be held together. And that is where most people live, without even realizing why. So the answer is not to increase effort, and it is not to become more aware of behavior, and it is not to try to correct every movement more precisely. All of that still works from the same misunderstanding. The answer is clarity. Clarity of position, not improvement of performance. Because if the position is clear, then everything that follows changes without being forced. The pressure that once sat underneath everything begins to lose its hold. Not because something new was added, but because something true was finally understood. Grace is not ahead of you, waiting for you to arrive at it. It is not something that increases as you improve. It is not something that depends on how well you manage what you are doing. It is where you stand. And if that becomes clear, and the effort that once defined everything begins to shift, not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but steadily, quietly, in a way that actually holds. Because now the movement is no longer trying to secure something. It is no longer trying to maintain something fragile. It is coming from something that is already settled. And that is the difference. That is why the order matters. Because when standing is first, walking becomes real, not forced, not unstable, not dependent on constant correction. But if standing is not clear, then walking will always feel like something that has to be managed. So this has to be seen first. Not partially, not quickly, not in passing. Clearly. Because everything that follows depends on it. So the answer is not to increase effort, and it is not to become more aware of behavior, and it is not to try to correct every movement more precisely. All of that still works from the same misunderstanding. The answer is clarity. Clarity of position, not improvement of performance. Because if the position is clear, then everything that follows changes without being forced. The pressure that once sat underneath everything begins to lose its hold, not because something new was added, but because something true was finally understood. Grace is not ahead of you, waiting for you to arrive at it. It is not something that increases as you improve. It is not something that depends on how well you manage what you are doing. It is where you stand. What most people call growth is often just adjustment. They are not actually standing on something new. They are constantly modifying what they are already doing. Tweaking behavior, refining habits, correcting patterns, trying to improve the overall outcome without ever questioning the foundation underneath it. And because of that, the focus stays on movement. It stays on what is changing, what is improving, what is getting closer to what they think it should be. But that entire approach assumes something that was never established. It assumes that progress is the goal. It assumes that movement is the measure. It assumes that if things are improving, then everything must be working. And none of those assumptions hold if the position itself is unclear. Because you can refine something that is unstable and make it look better for a time, but it will never carry weight the way it should. You can improve behavior. You can increase consistency. You can even reduce obvious failure and still remain in the same place underneath it all. Because none of those things change where you are standing. They only change how you are moving. And if standing is the issue, then movement will never solve it. It will only mask it. So what feels like growth can actually be maintenance. What feels like progress can actually be management. And what feels like change can simply be adjustment inside the same misunderstanding. That is why it continues. Because it looks right on the surface. It feels like something is happening. But underneath it, nothing is actually shifted. Effort feels right because it gives the sense that something is being done. It gives movement. It gives direction. It creates the impression that change is taking place. But effort cannot correct position. It can only operate within it. And if the position itself is unclear, then effort simply reinforces the same instability over and over again, just in more refined ways. That is why people can spend years improving, adjusting, becoming more aware, becoming more disciplined, and still carry the same underlying pressure. Because the root issue was never touched. The effort stayed focused on what was visible, while the problem remained in what was unseen. So the cycle continues, not because people are unwilling, but because they are working from the wrong reference point. They are trying to fix movement when the issue is standing. And those two are not the same. Because movement can be shaped, controlled, and refined, but standing either is or it is not. It does not gradually become stable through effort. It is either clear or it is not clear. And if it is not clear, then everything built on top of it will carry that uncertainty. That is why effort eventually leads to fatigue. Not always physical fatigue, but something deeper. A constant sense of needing to stay aware, needing to stay on top of things, needing to keep everything aligned. Because nothing underneath it feels completely settled. So the mind stays engaged, the attention stays active, the effort never fully releases. And over time, that becomes normal. Not because it should be, but because nothing else has replaced it. Because the position that would remove that pressure was never clearly seen. So effort remains, not as a solution, but as a substitute. So the issue is not that people are not trying. The issue is that what they are trusting to work was never designed to resolve the problem in the first place. Effort can shape behavior, but it cannot establish position. It can improve what is visible, but it cannot correct what everything is built on. And that is why the results never fully satisfy. Because even when progress is visible, it does not remove the underlying instability. It only makes it less obvious for a time. So people continue, not because it is working in a complete way, but because it is the only framework they have been given. Adjust, improve, correct, repeat. And within that system, there is no real exit point. There is only continuation. Because the system itself never leads back to the question that actually matters: where am I standing? That question is either avoided or replaced. Replaced with performance, replaced with effort, replaced with consistency, replaced with visible change. But none of those answer it. And until that question is faced directly, nothing truly shifts. Because everything else operates downstream from. So what seems like a path forward is often just a loop, a refined loop, a more disciplined loop, a more aware loop, but still the same loop. And that is why it feels like movement without resolution. Because it is. Until something outside of that system interrupts it. Not an improvement within it, an interruption of it. A shift away from effort as the foundation, and towards something that does not depend on it at all. So the answer is not found by improving what was already being done. It is not found by refining effort, or increasing awareness, or managing behavior more carefully. The answer begins with clarity. Not clarity of movement, but clarity of position. Because everything that follows depends on that. If the position is unclear, then everything built on top of it will carry that same uncertainty, no matter how refined it becomes. But if the position is clear, then everything that follows begins to settle without being forced. So the shift is not in doing more, it is in seeing differently. Grace is not something that responds to how well you perform. It is not something that increases as effort increases. It is not something that fluctuates based on how consistent you are. It is where you stand, already already given, already established. And that changes the reference point completely. Because now the question is no longer, how am I doing? It becomes, where am I standing? And that question does not lead to effort. It leads to clarity. Because standing is not something you gradually achieve through movement. It is something that must be understood as already true. And when that becomes clear, the pressure that once defined everything begins to lose its place. Not because something new was added, but because something real was finally seen for what it is. And that is where everything begins to shift. Because standing is not something that develops over time. It is not something that becomes more true as effort increases. And it is not something that stabilizes as behavior improves. It is either clear or it is not. And if it is not clear, then everything else will feel like it has to be maintained. That is why effort becomes constant. Not because people want it to be, but because nothing underneath it feels fully settled. So the mind stays engaged, the attention stays active. There is always something to correct, something to improve, something to watch. But when standing is clear, that entire structure begins to change, not all at once, and not in a way that draws attention to itself, but in a way that actually holds. Because now the stability is not coming from what is being done, it is coming from what is already established. And that removes the need for constant management. It removes the need to keep everything aligned through effort. It removes the sense that something could fall apart at any moment if attention slips. Because what you are standing on does not depend on how well you are maintaining it. It does not shift when you shift. It does not weaken when you feel weak. It does not improve when you perform better. It remains. And that is what changes the experience. Because now, instead of trying to secure something through movement, you are resting in something that is already secure. And from that place, movement is no longer driven by pressure. It becomes something entirely different. The difference is found in what is understood as already true. Because if that is unclear, then everything else continues to carry weight it was never meant to carry. Even when things look improved, even when there is visible progress, there is still something underneath it that does not feel completely settled. But when that becomes clear, the entire structure begins to shift in a way that does not depend on effort, not suddenly, and not in a way that draws attention to itself, but in a way that actually holds. Because now, the starting point is different. It is no longer based on what needs to be done. It is based on what is already established. And that changes how everything moves from that point forward. Because standing is no longer something in question. It is no longer something being worked toward. It is understood as already true. And when that is the case, movement no longer carries the same pressure. It no longer needs to produce something. It no longer needs to secure something. It is not trying to hold something together. It is moving from something that is already settled. And that is why the order matters. Standing comes first. Not eventually. Not as the result of progress, but first. Because without that, Everything else continues to circle around the same instability. But with that clear, the movement that follows is no longer forced. It becomes steady in a way that does not depend on constant correction. And that is what makes it real. That is what makes it hold. Most people think they understand what it means to walk, but what they are actually working with is a definition that was never clear to begin with. The idea of walking has been reduced to behavior. It has been reduced to doing better, being more consistent, correcting actions, improving habits, and maintaining a certain level of performance over time. So when they hear the word walk, what they think is movement that must be managed. Something that has to be kept in line, something that has to be sustained, something that depends on how well they are doing in any given moment. And because of that, the focus stays outward. It stays on actions, decisions, patterns, and visible change. It stays on what can be measured, what can be tracked, what can be improved. But that definition never questions where the movement is coming from. It never addresses the source. So walking becomes something you try to do correctly, instead of something that flows from what is already established. And once that shift happens, pressure is introduced immediately, because now the walk is something that can succeed or fail depending on performance. It becomes something that has to be maintained, something that has to be protected, something that can slip if attention drops. And that is not stability. That is management. So even when things appear to be going well, there is still an underlying sense that it has to be watched, adjusted, and kept together. Because the definition itself is built on effort, not on position. And until that definition is corrected, everything that follows will continue to carry that same pressure. Because walking will always feel like something that depends on you, instead of something that comes from where you already stand. Because movement is not the origin. It never was. What people see as walking is only the visible part of something that begins somewhere else. It is the result, not the source. It is the expression, not the cause. But when that is reversed, everything becomes unstable in a way that is not immediately obvious. Because now the focus is placed on what is happening instead of what it is coming from. So attention stays on behavior, on actions, on what is changing and what needs to be corrected. And the source is never clearly addressed. That is why the effort never fully releases. Because if movement is treated as the starting point, then it has to be constantly managed. It has to be adjusted, maintained, and watched closely, because it becomes the thing that determines whether everything is working or not. But movement was never meant to carry that weight. It was never meant to define the condition. It was never meant to establish anything. It only reflects what is already established. And when that is understood, the entire structure begins to shift. Because now the focus is no longer on controlling what is happening outwardly. It moves back to what is already true inwardly. Not as an idea, but as a fixed position. And from that position, movement takes on a different nature. It is no longer something that has to be sustained through effort. It is something that follows naturally. Not because because it is being forced, but because it is coming from something that does not need to be forced. And that is the difference between managing a walk and actually walking. So walking is not something you create, and it is not something you maintain through effort. It is not a system of managing behavior, and it is not a process of constantly correcting what you are doing. Walking is expression. It is the visible result of what is already established, and that is why it cannot be separated from position. Because if the position is unclear, then the expression will always feel like something that has to be controlled. It will feel like something that depends on how well it is being managed, how consistent it is, how closely it is being watched. But when the position is clear, the expression changes. Not because something new was added, but because what was already true is no longer being misunderstood. So walking is not an effort to become something. It is not a process of trying to secure something. It is not something that has to be held together through constant attention. It is what follows from something that is already settled. And that is why it does not carry the same pressure. Because it is not responsible for establishing anything. It is not responsible for maintaining anything. It is not responsible for producing something that does not already exist. It simply reflects what is already there. And when that is understood, the entire definition shifts. Walking is no longer something fragile. It is no longer something that feels like it could fail at any moment. It is no longer something that has to be watched closely to make sure it stays intact. It becomes something steady, not because of effort, but because of what it is coming from. And that is what makes it real. Because it is no longer being used to secure something. It is coming from something that is already secure. Even after hearing this, most people will still turn it back into performance without realizing it. Because the pattern is already familiar. They hear that walking is not effort, but expression. And instead of letting that settle, they begin trying to express correctly. They begin evaluating whether the walk looks right, whether it feels right, whether it is consistent enough to match what they think it should be. So the focus quietly shifts again, not back to obvious effort, but to a more subtle form of it. Now it becomes internal measurement, watching closely, checking constantly, evaluating whether what is happening matches the understanding they just received. And without realizing it, they have reintroduced the same system. Because the reference point is still themselves, still what they are doing, still how it looks, still how consistent it feels over time. And that creates a loop. Because every time something does not match the expectation, adjustment begins again. Not from position, but from observation. So the attention never fully releases. It stays engaged, it stays active, it stays focused on maintaining what should never have been maintained in the first place. And because of that, the walk never feels settled. Even with the correct definition, it still feels like something that has to be managed. Because the reference point never changed. It only became more refined. So instead of obvious performance, it becomes subtle performance. More aware, more controlled, but still dependent on what is being observed. And that is why the pressure remains. Not because the truth is unclear, but because the application of it has been turned back into effort again. Once the walk is turned back into something that has to be managed, pressure becomes unavoidable. Not always in an obvious way, and not always at a level that stands out immediately, but it stays present underneath everything. Because now there is something to maintain. Something that has to remain consistent. Something that has to be watched. Something that can slip if attention is not kept on it. And that creates a constant sense of responsibility that was never meant to be there. So the mind stays active. Not because it needs to, but because it feels like it has to. There is always something to check, something to adjust, something to keep aligned. Even when things are going well, there is still a sense that it has to continue that way, that it cannot afford to drift. And that is where the weight comes from. Because what should be stable begins to feel conditional. What should be settled begins to feel like it depends on ongoing effort. And over time, that changes the entire experience. It is no longer just about movement. It becomes about sustaining the movement, holding it together, keeping it from slipping. And that is not rest. That is maintenance. And maintenance requires constant attention. So even when there's progress, it does not bring stability. It only brings more to maintain. Because now there's something to preserve, something that has to stay in place. And that creates a cycle that never fully releases. Because the more that is built through effort, the more there is to maintain through effort. And nothing underneath it ever removes that need, because the system itself depends on it. And that is why it becomes heavy. Not because movement is wrong, but because it has been given a role it was never meant to carry. The reason this continues is because it appears to work. On the surface, there is movement. There is improvement. There is visible change. And that creates the sense that something is progressing in the right direction. So there is no reason to question it deeply. Because as long as things look like they are moving forward, the system feels valid. And that is what makes it difficult to see. Because the problem is not that nothing is happening. The problem is that what is happening never reaches the root. It only operates on what is visible. So the cycle continues without interruption. Adjustment, improvement, correction, repeat. And each time it feels like progress, even though the underlying condition has not actually shifted. Because the reference point never changed. It is still based on movement, still based on observation, still based on what is being measured. And as long as that remains in place, the system reinforces itself. Because every small improvement confirms it. Every visible change strengthens it. Every moment of consistency supports it. even though none of those things remove the instability underneath it. So it becomes self-sustaining, not because it resolves anything, but because it keeps producing results that appear valid. And that is the trap. Because it keeps attention focused on what is happening, instead of questioning where it is coming from. And as long as that continues, the system never breaks. It only refines itself. And the more refined it becomes, the harder it is to see that it is still the same thing. Because it looks better. It feels more controlled. It appears more stable. But underneath it, nothing is actually changed. Because the foundation was never addressed. And until that is seen clearly, the cycle will continue. Not because it has to, but because nothing has replaced it. So the shift is not into doing less, and it is not into trying to become passive. It is not a removal of movement, and it is not an absence of action. The shift is in where the movement is coming from. Because when the source is clear, the pressure that once sat behind everything no longer has a place. Not because movement stopped, but because it is no longer being used to establish something. It is no longer being used to secure something. It is no longer carrying the weight of maintaining something that could be lost. And that changes the nature of the walk. Because now it is not driven by the need to get somewhere. It is not driven by the need to hold something together. It is not driven by the need to stay within a certain line. It moves from something that is already settled. And that is what removes the pressure. Not a change in effort, but a change in source. Because when you are standing on something that does not shift, the movement that follows does not have to compensate for instability. It does not have to correct for weakness. It does not have to stay ahead of failure. It is no longer reactive. It becomes steady. Not because it is being controlled carefully, but because it is coming from something that does not need to be controlled. And that is what makes it different. Because it is no longer dependent on how well it is being managed. It is flowing from something that is already secure. And that is where the walk begins to change. When the source is no longer in question, movement no longer carries the same instability. It is not constantly being checked. It is not being watched for signs of failure. It is not being adjusted in real time to keep everything aligned, because it is not responsible for holding anything together. That responsibility is no longer placed on it, so the need to monitor it begins to fall away. Not completely at first, but steadily. Because there is nothing underneath it that feels like it could collapse if attention is not maintained. And that changes how movement is experienced. It becomes quieter. Not in the sense that nothing is happening, but in the sense that it is no longer driven by pressure. There is no constant need to evaluate it. No need to measure it against a standard. No need to keep it within a certain range. Because it is no longer the thing that determines whether everything is working. It is simply what follows. And because of that, it is no longer fragile. It does not feel like it could fall apart at any moment. It does not feel like it depends on how closely it is being watched. It is steady in a way that does not require constant correction, not because it is perfect, but because it is coming from something that is already established, and that removes the fear that once sat behind it, the fear of slipping, the fear of losing ground, the fear that everything depends on maintaining it correctly. Because none of that applies in the same way anymore. So movement becomes something that does not have to be protected. It does not have to be sustained through effort. It is not carrying something that could be lost. It is simply moving from something that is already secure. And that is what makes it stable. So the walk is not something that is built through effort. And it is not something that is maintained through consistency. It is not something that improves as performance improves. And it is not something that weakens when performance weakens. It does not operate on that system. The walk is the expression of what is already established. Because of that, it does not carry the responsibility of securing anything. It does not have to produce something. It does not have to hold something together. It does not have to stay within a certain range to remain valid. It is not fragile in that way, because it is not the source. It is what follows from the source. And when that is clear, the pressure that once defined it no longer has a place. Not because movement stopped, but because movement is no longer being used to establish anything. So it is not driven by the need to get somewhere. It is not driven by the need to maintain something. It is not driven by the need to prevent something from being lost. It moves from something that is already settled. And that is why it does not strive. Not because there is no movement, but because there is nothing behind it forcing it forward. And that is the difference. Because when movement is driven by effort, it always carries weight. But when movement comes from what is already established, it does not carry that same weight. It remains steady. Not because it is being managed carefully, but because it is coming from something that does not need to be managed. And that is what defines the walk. So the walk is not something that is built through effort. Even when the position is clear, the experience does not always follow immediately. Not because something is missing, and not because the position itself is unstable, but because the thinking has not yet aligned with what is already true. So there can be a disconnect. A person can be established in something that is fixed, and still think in a way that does not reflect it. And when that happens, the experience will follow the thinking, not the position. Not in terms of what is true, but in terms of what is felt what is perceived and how everything is processed moment to moment. Because thinking acts as the lens through which everything is interpreted. So even when the foundation is stable, the experience can still feel uncertain if the thinking has not caught up to it. That is why there can still be pressure. Not because the position requires it, but because the mind is still operating from an older reference point. A reference point that was built on effort, on performance, on maintaining something instead of standing in something. And that does not disappear automatically. It remains until it is seen clearly. So the result is tension, not between what is true and what is false, but between what is true and how it is being interpreted. Because one is fixed and the other is still adjusting. And until those come into alignment, the experience will continue to feel inconsistent. Not because the truth is inconsistent, but because the thinking has not yet settled into it. Thinking does not define what is true, but it does shape how what is true is experienced. And that distinction is often missed. Because when something feels a certain way, it is easy to assume that the feeling reflects reality itself, rather than the way reality is being interpreted. So if there is pressure, it feels like something must still be unstable. If there is uncertainty, it feels like something must still be unclear. If there is effort, it feels like something must still depend on it. But those conclusions come from the thinking, not from the position. Because the position does not change based on how it is perceived. It does not shift based on how it is felt. It does not weaken based on how it is processed. It remains what it is, regardless of how it is being interpreted. But the experience can still move. Because the mind is still interpreting everything through patterns that were formed before the position was understood. And those patterns do not automatically disappear. They continue to operate until they are replaced. So there can be a difference between what is true and what is being experienced. Not because truth is unstable, but because interpretation has not yet aligned with it. And that is why it is possible to stand in something that is fixed and still feel like it is shifting. Not because it is shifting, but because the thinking has not yet settled into what is already stable. So the issue is not with reality. The issue is with how reality is being processed. And until that becomes clear, the experience will continue to follow the thinking, even when the thinking does not reflect what is actually true. The mind was never meant to establish what is true. It was never designed to determine position. And it does not have the ability to make something stable or unstable. But it does interpret. It takes what is already true, and it processes it through what it has learned, what it has repeated, and what it has come to expect over time. So it functions as a lens. Not the source, but the way the source is seen. And that is why it matters. Because if the lens is unclear, then even what is stable can appear unstable. Even what is fixed can feel uncertain. Not because it is changing, but because it is being interpreted through patterns that do not match it. And those patterns do not correct themselves automatically. They continue to operate until they are replaced by something clearer. So the mind will either align with what is already true, or it will continue to interpret everything through what it has known before. And that determines the experience. Not the position itself, but how the position is perceived, processed, and lived out. Because the position does not move, but the interpretation does. And if the interpretation remains tied to old patterns, then the experience will continue to reflect those patterns, even when the truth has already been established. So the role of the mind is not to create truth, and it is not to maintain truth. It is to come into alignment with what is already true. And when that happens, the experience begins to stabilize. Not because something new was created, but because what is already established is no longer being misinterpreted. The mind does not start from a neutral position. It starts from what it has been trained to expect. And for most people, that training has been built around effort, built around performance, around cause and effect, around the idea that what happens is directly tied to what is being done. So when something is understood that does not fit that pattern, the mind does not immediately align with it. It defaults back to what it already knows. It looks for something to do, something to adjust, something to manage, because that is the system it has learned to trust, and that happens automatically. Not because it is choosing to resist, but because it has not yet been replaced. So even when the truth is clear, the thinking will still move in the direction it has always moved, back toward effort, back toward performance, back toward trying to maintain something. And that creates a constant pull, a pull away from what is already established and back into what feels familiar. Because effort feels natural, it feels like control, it feels like something is being done. But that does not make it correct. It only makes it familiar. And until that is recognized, the mind will continue to default to it, even while hearing something different, even while understanding something different. Because default thinking does not change just because truth is introduced. It changes when it is replaced. When the truth is clear, but the thinking has not yet aligned, conflict is unavoidable. Not conflict in what is true, but conflict in how it is being processed. Because one system says that everything is already established, already secure, already in place. And the other system continues to operate as if everything depends on what is being done. So both are present at the same time, not blending together, but pulling in different directions. Because the position does not change, but the thinking has not yet settled into it. So there is tension, a constant sense that something is not fully resolved. Because one part is resting in what is already true, while another part is still trying to manage it, still trying to maintain it, still trying to make sure it holds, and that creates a divided experience. Not because there are two truths, but because there are two interpretations operating at once. One based on clarity, the other based on what has always been familiar. And as long as both remain active, the experience will continue to shift between them. At times it will feel stable. At times it will feel pressured. At times it will feel clear. At times it will feel uncertain. Not because anything is changing in the position, but because the thinking is moving between two different ways of processing it. And that is what creates the instability. Not the truth itself, but the conflict in how it is being interpreted. And until that conflict is resolved, the experience will continue to move back and forth, even while the truth remains unchanged. Even when the truth is understood, the mind will still attempt to bring it back into the system it knows. Not by rejecting it directly, but by reinterpreting it. So what was clear begins to be processed through familiar patterns again. Standing becomes something to maintain. Walking becomes something to manage. Clarity becomes something to hold on to. And without realizing it, the entire structure is shifted back into effort. Because the mind is not comfortable with what it does not yet recognize as stable. So it tries to stabilize it the only way it knows how, by turning it into something that can be controlled, something that can be measured, something that can be maintained. And that is where the pullback happens. Not away from truth itself, but away from the way truth actually functions. Because instead of letting it remain as something already established, the mind begins to treat it as something that must be preserved, something that could be lost, something that depends on continued attention, and that reintroduces pressure immediately. Because now the clarity that was seen becomes something that has to be held in place, something that has to be kept from slipping, something that depends on staying aware of it. And that is the same system again, just operating in a more refined way. So instead of obvious effort, it becomes subtle effort. Instead of external performance, it becomes internal management. But it is still effort, still pressure, still dependent on what is being done. And that is why it feels like it keeps returning. Not because the truth is unclear, but because the mind keeps trying to fit it into a system it was never meant to operate in. And until that is seen clearly, the pullback will continue. Not because it has to. So the shift does not begin with trying to think better. And it does not begin with forcing the mind to stay in a certain place. It begins with seeing clearly what is already true. Not in a general sense, but specifically. That you are in Christ. That you are already justified. Not becoming justified over time. that you are already accepted, not moving toward acceptance. That there is no condemnation placed on you, not now and not later, based on how you perform. And that is the position. Not something you maintain, not something you improve, not something that strengthens as you do better. It is already established. And the mind does not align with that by effort. It aligns with that by seeing it clearly enough that the old patterns no longer hold the same authority. Because once it is seen that acceptance is not being worked toward, the need to measure everything against it begins to fall away. Once it is seen that justification is not dependent on performance, the pressure to maintain it begins to lose its place. And once it is seen that being in Christ is not something that shifts based on behavior, the instability that came from trying to hold it together begins to weaken. Not because effort was applied to remove it, but because what was already true was finally seen without being filtered through what used to be assumed. So, the renewal of the mind is not about forcing new thoughts into place. It is about replacing what was unclear with what is already true, and letting that become the reference point. Not gradually, but clearly. When the mind begins to align with what is already true in Christ, the experience begins to stabilize in a way that effort could never produce. Not because something new is being created, but because the reference point is no longer shifting. Because now the thinking is no longer moving between performance and acceptance. It is settling into the fact that acceptance has already been given. Not conditionally, not temporarily, but fully. That you are already justified. Not progressing toward it, not maintaining it, but standing in it. And that removes the need to constantly measure where you stand. Because where you stand is no longer in question. You are in Christ. And that does not move with your performance. It does not improve when you improve. It does not weaken when you struggle. It remains what it is. And when that becomes the reference point for thinking, the instability that once came from trying to stay aligned begins to fall away. Because alignment is no longer something you are trying to hold together. It is something that follows clarity. So the mind is no longer working to maintain a position. It is settling into one that is already established, and that changes the experience. Because now the walk is no longer being monitored constantly. It is no longer being evaluated against whether it is good enough. It is no longer being corrected in real time to make sure it stays acceptable. Because acceptance is no longer tied to it. You are already accepted in Christ. And there is no condemnation placed on you that rises and falls based on how you are doing. So the need to keep everything in place through effort begins to release. Not all at once, but steadily. Because the mind is no longer returning to the same question. It has been answered. And when that answer becomes the place thinking comes from, the entire experience becomes more consistent. Not because effort increased, but because the reference point no longer moves. So the mind is not the source of what is true, and it is not the means by which truth is maintained. It does not establish your position, and it does not keep your position in place, because your position is already established in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that rises or falls based on what you do. That does not come from the mind. That is already true. So the role of the mind is not to create that reality, and it is not to protect it. It is to come into alignment with it, to see clearly what is already established without filtering it back through effort, performance, or maintenance. Because once the mind stops trying to secure what is already secure, the pressure that came from trying to hold it together no longer has a place. There is nothing to maintain. There is nothing to preserve. There is nothing to keep from slipping. Because what is true does not depend on how well it is being thought about. It remains true regardless. And when that becomes the reference point, the internal conflict that once moved everything back and forth begins to settle. Not because effort was applied to control it, but because the truth that was already there is no longer being misinterpreted. So the mind aligned is not a mind that is trying harder. It is not a mind that is managing thoughts more carefully. It is a mind that is no longer resisting what is already true in Christ. And because of that, it becomes stable. Not because it is controlling the outcome, but because it is no longer working against the position that was already established. And that is what allows everything else to hold. Because now the walk is no longer being pulled back into effort. It is moving from what is already true without needing to secure it. And that is what brings it to rest. Warfare does not take place in your position, and it does not take place in what has already been established in Christ. Because your position is not something that can be attacked, changed, or weakened. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that rises or falls based on what you do. That is fixed. So the conflict does not exist there. It exists in how that is being processed. It exists in how that is being interpreted. It exists in the mind. Because the mind is where alignment either holds or shifts, and that is where pressure shows up. Not as a direct attack on what is true, but as a challenge to how what is true is being understood. So the battlefield is not your standing. It is your thinking about your standing. Because what is true remains unchanged, but the way it is seen can still be influenced. It can still be questioned. It can still be reinterpreted. And when that happens, the experience begins to shift. Not because anything has changed in Christ, but because the mind has moved away from what is already established. So warfare is not about protecting your position. It is not about fighting to stay accepted. It is not about maintaining something that could be lost. Because none of that is true. Warfare is about whether the mind remains aligned with what is already true in Christ, or begins to move back into something else. And that is where the conflict actually takes place. The target is not your position in Christ, but the truth about your position in Christ. Because that position is already established. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that changes based on what you do. That is not what is being attacked. What is being challenged is how clearly that is seen. Because if that clarity is weakened, then everything that follows begins to shift, not in reality, but in experience. So the target is specific. It is the understanding that you are already justified, not becoming justified over time. It is the understanding that you are already accepted, not moving toward acceptance. It is the understanding that being in Christ is not something that strengthens with performance or weakens with failure. And it is the understanding that no condemnation means exactly that. Not reduced condemnation. Not delayed condemnation. None. Because if any of those are reinterpreted even slightly, the system begins to change. Acceptance becomes conditional. Justification becomes progressive. Being in Christ becomes something that feels like it has to be maintained. And no condemnation becomes something that is quietly questioned. And once that happens, the pressure returns. Not because anything has changed in truth, but because the truth is no longer being seen clearly. So the target is not you. It is the clarity of what is already true about you in Christ. Because if that can be distorted, then everything built on it begins to feel unstable, even while it remains completely fixed. The method is not always obvious, and it is rarely direct. It does not usually come as a clear rejection of what is true. It comes as a subtle shift in how what is true is interpreted. Because the truth that you are in Christ is not denied outright. It is adjusted. It is framed in a way that makes it feel conditional, as if it depends on how you are doing, as if it strengthens when you are consistent and weakens when you are not. And the same happens with justification. Not denied, but quietly turned into something that feels progressive. Something that seems to grow or shrink based on performance. And acceptance follows the same pattern. It begins as something already given, but is slowly reinterpreted as something that has to be maintained, something that has to be kept in place, something that can be affected by how well you are doing. And no condemnation is not removed entirely. It is softened. It becomes something that is not always present, but still possible, something that could return under the right conditions. And that is how the shift happens. Not through open contradiction, but through subtle reinterpretation. Because once the meaning changes, even slightly, the experience begins to follow that change. So what was once clear becomes uncertain. What was once stable begins to feel conditional. And what was once settled begins to feel like it needs to be managed again. And that is how pressure returns. Not because the truth has changed, but because the way it is being understood has shifted. And that shift is enough to move everything back into effort, even while the words themselves remain the same. is not always obvious, and it is rarely direct. Accusation does not always come as something loud or obvious. It often comes as a quiet suggestion that something about your standing is not what it should be. Not a direct denial, but a question. A subtle pressure that begins to form around what is already true in Christ. Because you are in Christ, you are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. But accusation introduces a different perspective. It suggests that something about that may not fully apply, that perhaps you are not where you should be, that something is off, that something needs to be corrected before everything is truly right. And it does not always say it clearly. It is often implied, felt as pressure, felt as a sense that something is not fully aligned. And once that suggestion is accepted, even slightly, the reference point begins to shift. Because now the focus moves from what is already established to what seems like it needs to be fixed. And that reintroduces effort immediately. Because if something is wrong, then something must be done. If something is off, then it has to be corrected. And that pulls the mind back into performance, back into measurement, back into trying to secure what was already secure. And that is how accusation works. Not by removing what is true, but by placing doubt around it. And once the doubt is entertained, the pressure begins to build again. Not because anything changed in Christ, but because the mind has moved away from what was already clear. Doubt moves beyond suggestion and begins to question directly. Not always out loud, and not always in a way that is immediately recognized, but in a way that introduces uncertainty into what was already clear. Because you are in Christ, you are already justified, you are already accepted, and there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. But doubt begins to ask whether that fully applies, not in general, but personally. It raises the question of whether that is actually true in your case, whether something about you places you outside of that in some way, whether something you have done or something you are still doing affects that standing more than it should. And those questions do not have to be answered to have an effect. They only have to be entertained. Because once they are, certainty begins to weaken, not in reality, but in perception. So what was once clear begins to feel less certain. What was once stable begins to feel conditional. And what was once settled begins to feel like it needs to be confirmed again. And that shifts everything. Because now the mind is no longer resting in what is already true. It is searching for reassurance, trying to confirm what was already established, trying to make sure it still applies. And that brings effort back into place. Because if something might not be true, then it has to be verified. It has to be secured. It has to be made certain again. And that is how doubt works. Not by proving something false, but by making what is true feel uncertain. And once that uncertainty is present, the mind begins to move again. Not from clarity, but from the need to resolve. what now feels unclear. Distraction does not argue with what is true. It simply moves attention away from it. Because as long as the focus remains on what is already established in Christ, the clarity holds. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. But distraction shifts the focus somewhere else. It moves attention toward circumstances, toward behavior, toward how things feel in the moment, toward what is happening externally or internally. And once attention is no longer fixed on what is already true, the clarity begins to fade. Not because it has changed, but because it is no longer what is being seen. So the mind begins to process everything from what is visible, from what is immediate, from what is changing. And that reintroduces instability. Because now the reference point is no longer fixed, it is shifting with whatever is being focused on. So if circumstances change, the sense of stability changes. If behavior fluctuates, the sense of standing fluctuates. If feelings shift, the sense of certainty shifts with them. And that creates movement away from what is already settled. Not through argument, but through redirection. Because the truth has not been removed. It has simply been replaced in focus. And whatever holds attention becomes the reference point. So when attention moves away from being in Christ, from being already justified, from being already accepted, and from there being no condemnation, everything begins to feel like it depends on what is happening instead. And that is how distraction works. Not by changing what is true, but by changing what is being looked at. And once that happens, the mind follows that direction, even while the truth remains unchanged. The response is not to fight every thought, and it is not to try to force the mind back into place through effort. It begins with recognition. Because once it is clear what is true in Christ, it also becomes possible to see when something does not match it. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. So when a thought suggests that something is off in your standing, it can be seen for what it is. Not as something that needs to be fixed, but as something that does not align with what is already true. When doubt questions whether that applies to you, it can be recognized. Not as something that needs to be resolved through effort, but as something that does not match what has already been established. And when distraction pulls attention away, that shift can be seen as well. Not as something that has changed the truth, but as something that has moved focus away from it. And that is where clarity returns. Not by trying to correct everything, but by seeing what does not belong. Because once something is recognized as not aligning with what is already true in Christ, it no longer carries the same authority. It is no longer treated as something that defines reality. It is seen as something that does not match it, and that changes how it is processed. Because now the response is not reaction, it is recognition. And recognition does not require effort. It requires clarity. Clarity of what is already established, and clarity of what does not align with it. And that is where the shift begins. The response is not to fight every thought. Once something is recognized as not aligning with what is true, the next step is not to correct it through effort. It is to return to what is already established, not by trying to make it true again, but by coming back to what has never changed. Because you are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing, that has not moved. So the return is not a process of rebuilding something. It is a shift in where the mind is resting from what was being suggested back to what is already true. And that does not require force. It does not require repetition to make it hold. It requires clarity. Because once it is clear that nothing has changed in your position, the need to fix something begins to fall away. There is nothing to fix. There is nothing to restore. There is nothing to secure again, because it was never lost. So the movement is simple. From misalignment back to alignment. From what was being entertained back to what is already established. And that is where stability returns. Not through effort, but through clarity of what has remained the same the entire time. Because the truth does not move. And when the mind returns to it, everything else begins to settle again. So warfare is not about fighting to become something. And it is not about protecting your position in Christ. Because your position is not at risk. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that rises or falls based on what you do. That does not change. So the conflict is not over what is true. It is over whether the mind remains aligned with what is already true. And that is where everything takes place. Not in striving, not in reacting, not in trying to overcome something through effort, but in seeing clearly what is already established. Because once that is clear, the need to fight begins to fall away. There is nothing to defend. There is nothing to secure. There is nothing to hold in place, because it is already fixed. So the response is not pressure. It is not urgency. It is not intensity. It is stability, a steady return to what is already true in Christ. Not as something that is being repeated to make it real, but as something that is already real, whether it is being thought about or not. And that removes the weight. Because now, the mind is no longer trying to maintain alignment. It is resting in what is already established. And that is what defines standing without striving. Not the absence of conflict, but the absence of effort to resolve what is already resolved. Because nothing about your position needs to be secured. It already is. And when that is clear, the conflict no longer carries the same force, because it no longer has the same place to operate. And that is what brings it to an end. The return to effort does not usually happen all at once. It does not come as a clear decision to leave what is true in Christ. It happens gradually. A slow shift in thinking, a quiet movement away from what was once clear. Because you are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. None of that has changed. But the focus begins to move. Attention shifts slightly. Thinking starts to operate from patterns that were there before clarity came. Not in an obvious way, but in small adjustments. Small reinterpretations, small moments of returning to what feels familiar. And those small shifts begin to build, because the mind does not always recognize them immediately. They do not feel like a departure. They feel like normal thinking. So the reference point begins to change, not suddenly, but over time. And as it does, the experience begins to follow. Stability starts to feel less consistent. Pressure begins to return in subtle ways. Not enough to stand out at first, but enough to change how things are being processed. And eventually, what was once clear begins to feel less settled. Not because anything has changed in Christ, but because the mind has moved away from resting in what is already true. And that is how the drift happens. Not through a clear rejection, but through a gradual shift in where thinking is coming from. And if that is not recognized, it continues quietly. Until the old patterns feel normal again. Even while the truth remains unchanged. The reason the drift is not immediately recognized is because what it returns to feels familiar. It feels natural. Because the patterns of thinking that operate from effort have been established for a long time. They have been repeated. They have been reinforced. They have been trusted as the way things work. So when the mind begins to move back toward them, it does not feel like something is wrong. It feels like something is normal. Even when the truth is clear that you are in Christ, already justified, already accepted, and under no condemnation, those patterns do not disappear automatically. They remain as default responses, default ways of interpreting what is happening, default ways of processing pressure, change, and uncertainty. So when something shifts, the mind returns to what it knows, not because it is choosing to reject what is true, but because it has not yet fully settled into it. And that is why effort feels natural. It feels like control. It feels like responsibility. It feels like something is being done to keep things in place, even though none of that is required, because what is true in Christ does not depend on that. It does not need to be maintained. It does not need to be secured. It does not need to be held together. But the mind has learned to operate that way. So when clarity fades even slightly, it returns to what it knows. And what it knows is effort. What it knows is performance. What it knows is managing what feels like it could shift. And that is why the drift continues. Not because the truth is unclear, but because what is familiar still feels more natural than what is already established. Until that changes. When the sense of stability begins to shift, the immediate assumption is that something has gone wrong. Not in thinking, but in position. It feels like something has changed, because the experience no longer feels as settled as it did before. So the conclusion is made that something must now be different in where you stand. But that is not what has changed. You are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing, that remains exactly the same. What has shifted is how it is being processed. But because the experience feels different, it is interpreted as if the truth itself has changed. And that is where the mistake happens. Because once it is assumed that something has changed in your position, the response becomes effort, trying to get back, trying to restore what feels like it was lost, trying to become stable again. And that rebuilds the entire system. Because now the focus is no longer on what is already established. It is on fixing what feels broken, even though nothing in Christ has actually changed. So the effort increases. Attention sharpens. Monitoring returns. All in an attempt to regain something that was never lost. And that creates the cycle. Because the more effort is applied, the more the system of performance is reinforced. And the more that system is reinforced, the further the mind moves away from simply resting in what is already true. So the instability is not the problem. The misinterpretation of it is. Because if it is seen correctly, nothing needs to be rebuilt. Nothing needs to be restored. Nothing needs to be secured again. Because the position has not moved. Only the perception of it has. And once that is clear, the need to return through effort begins to fall away. Once clarity begins to fade, the natural response is to try to hold on to it. Not in an obvious way at first, but in a subtle shift in how it is approached. What was once seen clearly is now treated as something that has to be maintained, something that has to be kept in place, something that can be lost if it is not held on to carefully, and that changes everything. Because now the focus is no longer on what is already true in Christ. It is on keeping that clarity from slipping. But nothing about your position in Christ needs to be held together. You are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. that has not moved. So the attempt to hold on to clarity is built on the assumption that something has to be preserved. But there is nothing to preserve. Because what is true does not weaken when it is not being actively thought about. It does not fade when attention shifts, it remains what it is. But when clarity is treated as something that must be maintained, pressure returns immediately. Because now there is something to keep, something to protect, something to stay aware of at all times, and that creates effort again. Because if it can be lost, then it has to be held. If it can slip, then it has to be secured. And that turns clarity into a responsibility instead of something that is already established. So the more it is held, the more pressure it carries. And the more pressure it carries, the less stable it feels. Because it is no longer being rested in. It is being managed. And that is how the return to effort begins again. Once clarity is treated as something that has to be maintained, structure begins to form around it. Not intentionally at first, but naturally. Because if something must be kept in place, then attention must be given to it. And that attention turns into monitoring, watching closely, checking consistently, measuring whether it still feels as clear as it did before. And from there, adjustment begins. If it feels less clear, something must be done. If it feels unstable, something must be corrected. If it feels like it is slipping, something must be reinforced. And that rebuilds the system. Not the same way it was before, but in a more subtle form. Because now it is not just behavior being monitored, it is clarity itself. It is how well things are understood, how steady it feels, how consistent it remains over time. And that becomes the new performance. Because now there is something to measure again, something to improve, something to keep aligned. Even though nothing about your position in Christ depends on that. You are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. That has not changed. But the focus is shifted back to what is being done, even if what is being done is internal. And that brings effort back into place. Because now the mind is responsible for keeping everything clear, keeping everything steady, keeping everything aligned. And that creates pressure. Because it is trying to maintain something that was never meant to be maintained. So the system rebuilds. Not through obvious performance, but through subtle management. And that is what makes it harder to see. Because it feels like clarity is being protected. When in reality, effort has returned. When clarity is turned into something that has to be maintained, and the forms begins to rebuild around it, the result is always the same. It becomes exhausting. Not always immediately, and not always in a way that is easy to explain. But over time it begins to wear on the mind. Because there is always something to keep in place, something to watch, something to make sure has not shifted. And that requires constant attention, constant checking, constant adjustment, even if it is subtle, even if it is internal. and that never fully releases, because the system itself depends on it. The more clarity is treated as something to maintain, the more effort is required to maintain it. And the more effort is required, the more unstable it begins to feel. Because anything that depends on effort will always feel like it could slip. So the cycle continues. Clarity, then drift, then effort, then temporary stability, then drift again. And each time it happens, it feels like starting over. Because the system never actually resolves the problem. It only manages it for a time. Even though nothing about your position in Christ has ever changed, you are still in Christ. You are still justified. You are still accepted. And there is still no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing. That has remained the same the entire time. But because the response has been built on effort, the experience never fully settles. So it becomes tiring. Not because truth is difficult, but because effort is constant. And effort was never meant to carry that weight. So the cycle continues until it is seen clearly, not improved, not managed, seen. Because once it is seen for what it is, there is nothing left to sustain it. And that is where the cycle breaks. It becomes exhausting. Endurance is not holding on to clarity, and it is not maintaining what has already been seen. It is continuing in what is already true, because nothing about your position in Christ needs to be sustained. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing, that does not move. So endurance is not about keeping yourself there. It is about not leaving what is already established in your thinking, not by force, but by clarity. Because once it is clear that nothing has changed, the need to rebuild, to restore, or to secure something begins to fall away. There is nothing to return to through effort. There is nothing to regain. There is nothing to hold in place, because it has not moved. So continuing is simple. Not easy at first, but simple. It is remaining in the understanding that what is true in Christ remains true, regardless of what is felt, regardless of what is happening, regardless of how consistent it seems in the moment. And that removes the cycle. Because now the response to drift is not effort, it is clarity. The response to instability is not rebuilding, it is seeing that nothing has changed. And the response to pressure is not trying harder. It is returning to what has remained the same the entire time. And that is what endurance actually is. Not sustaining something fragile, but continuing in what is already fixed. When the mind remains aligned with what is already true in Christ, stability over time is no longer something that has to be created. It becomes the natural result. Not because everything feels consistent in every moment, but because the reference point no longer moves. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that depends on how you are doing, that remains the same. So even when thoughts shift, even when attention moves, even when there are moments of uncertainty, the return is no longer built on effort. It is built on clarity. Because nothing has changed. And over time, that begins to settle in a deeper way. Not through repetition to make it true, but through seeing it clearly enough that the mind stops trying to replace it with something else. So the movement becomes steady. Not because it is being controlled, but because it is no longer being redirected back into effort. There is less reaction, less urgency, less need to fix what feels off. Because what is true is no longer being questioned in the same way. And that creates consistency. Not perfect consistency in experience, but consistency in where everything returns to. Because the return point is fixed. It is not shifting based on how things feel. It is not changing based on what is happening. It remains what it is. And over time, that becomes the place the mind rests. Not occasionally, but regularly. Not through effort, but through clarity that no longer gets replaced as easily. And that is what creates stability over time. Not maintaining something, but no longer leaving what is already established. So endurance is not maintaining your position. And it is not holding on to what has already been seen. It is not keeping yourself accepted. It is not preserving what is already true, because none of that depends on you. You are in Christ. You are already justified. You are already accepted. And there is no condemnation placed on you that rises or falls based on what you do. That is fixed. So endurance is not about keeping that in place. It is about continuing in the clarity of it, not through effort, but through seeing clearly that it has not changed. Because nothing about your position moves when your experience shifts. Nothing about your standing in Christ is affected by how consistent things feel. Nothing about your justification or acceptance is strengthened by performance or weakened by failure. It remains what it is. So the response over time is not to hold on. It is not to try to stay in it. It is not to manage it carefully. It is to return again and again to what has remained the same the entire time. Not to make it true, but because it is true, and that removes the cycle. Because now there is nothing to rebuild, nothing to restore, nothing to secure again, only something to see clearly and to continue in. And that is what endurance actually is. Not striving to remain, but no longer leaving what is already established in Christ. And that is what makes it hold.